Beautiful. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this lovely, lovely evening. Let's see, anybody here? Eric, thank you so much for joining. Hope you're doing well. If you're just showing up, if you go ahead and answer a little poll I threw up in the little chat. Go ahead and answer that. Let me kind of know where you're at. And we'll get going in just a second. Some of you might notice my background looks a little different this time. I'm in a new streaming location, so it's been a fun couple days getting that all set up. But here we are. I'm going to talk about some technology. Going to talk about some good little contextualization practice. So in essence, we're here to put the age of exploration in context, and we're going to talk a little bit about the technology that makes the age of exploration possible. And we're essentially going to cover that information and practice contextualization. Now, if you happen to be at the DBQ review session that happened a few days back, you might have learned a little bit about context. It's one of an essential part of the DBQ, as well as an LEQ. And so I would encourage you, maybe after this particular stream, to go ahead and keep following up with the DBQ series, the DBQ review series that we're doing. I put a little call to action button down here. You can go ahead and click and save your spot to attend that. That'll be tomorrow evening. So here's looking forward to that. But we're going to go ahead and get going. I see some people filled out the poll. Awesome, cool. We're going to go ahead and get going. We're going to talk about some technology. We're talking about some technology. But first, as always, of course, think Fiveable. We are here to help you. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Instagram. Follow us on YouTube. We've got great folks. Got great streams coming up. Speaking of which, we've got some real good stuff coming up. As I was saying just a minute ago, we got the DBQ series, which is continuing with the thesis tomorrow night at the same time as 5 o'clock Western time, 8 p.m. Eastern time. With Patrick, he's going to walk you through the steps to do a killer thesis, a kick butt thesis. So if you attended that first DBQ review session, I would encourage you to check out this one just to keep going and really get that DBQ down. Then a little bit later, on Wednesday, we have Changing Social Hierarchies with Donald, and he's going to talk a little bit about social hierarchies in both Eurasia as well as the Americas. That's going to be really interesting. I'm personally a big fan of studying social dynamics, and so that's going to be something to look forward to. And then I'll be back with you guys again on Wednesday evening. We're going to be talking about resisting empires in Unit 4. So we're going to talk all about some people who didn't really like the Age of Exploration and sought to undermine this. We've got some great streams coming up. So we've got a packed week, and hopefully you'll stick by and join us the rest of those. Here's a quick rundown of what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about contextualization just a little bit. We're going to talk about Unit 4.1 just a little bit, give you a little overview, and then we're going to go ahead and we're just going to get right into the nitty-gritty and the details and all the stuff you came here to learn about or discuss. That said, it looks like some of you have already covered the Age of Exploration in your class, and so if you have a question, if something comes up, you heard your teacher say something, it didn't make a lot of sense, or I've said something and it doesn't make a lot of sense, we got the chat. It's right here. Throw a question up in the chat. I welcome it. This is what we do. We participate here. So by all means, feel free to jump on in. Not a problem at all. If you're a teacher, stick tight to the end. I got some ideas for you on how you can address these topics in your class. So all that said, let's go ahead and begin. I want to begin with a little question for you. I have here a lovely picture of a lovely model ship. And what I'd like you to do, if you could be so kind, is just go ahead and look at this picture. And let me know in chat if anything jumps out at you, just kind of looking at this ship. Maybe you have a preconceived notion of what a ship should look like in your head. Does anything kind of like jump out at you, catch your eye, something very noticeable about this particular ship? Anything stand out to you about this particular ship? Because this is a ship we're going to talk a little bit about today. And just we'll take a few seconds, and if anyone has any thoughts, they can throw them up in chat. So Qinglong says Christopher Columbus. That is actually not a bad kind of first impression. This particular model of ship was not one of the ones that Columbus himself used, but there are some features of it that he did use. So actually, I take that back. One of the ships that Christopher Columbus used was this particular ship, but not all three of them. Melissa points out a really deep keel. That's true. We usually don't think of ships being so deep underwater, and Eric has pointed out the crosses on the sails, all of which are excellent observations. So, like I said, this particular ship is referred to as a carrack, and it was one of the three ships that Christopher Columbus sailed with was a carrack. So that's not a bad analogy to make. Are the crosses a religious symbol? The cross is some sort of religious symbol. Well, this model ship is the model of a Portuguese ship, I believe. And the coat of arms of the state of Portugal, Kingdom of Portugal back then, was a cross, and that was in part a religious symbol, yes. So you're not, Qinglong, you're not too far off the mark. There's some religious overtone, if not some overt religious symbolism there. For those of you who might know, the cross is a very important symbol in Christianity. So many Christian states made a very big point of putting this cross on their ships. Melissa points out something in particular of interest. It has a deep keel. I don't think of ships being so deep underwater. Part of the reason it has such a deep keel, part of the reason it can go so deep underwater is kind of what I want to talk to you a little bit about. So this model of ship, this carrack, actually uses what's called the Carvel form of shipbuilding, or sorry, Caravel form of shipbuilding. And I'm going to show you exactly what that means in a second. But what I thought the very first time, actually, Eric just said it. The sails are different shapes. That's one of the things that caught my eye the very first time I looked at a picture like this, is that the sails are different shapes. And there's a reason for that. You might have noticed that the front ones are square sails. The bottom ones are square sails, and the ones near the top are still squarish. But the one in the back is a triangle sail. This is what does anyone remember what the triangle sail is referred to as? Just out of curiosity, this would have been something way back in Unit 1. Someone got the triangle sail by any chance? Give you a hint. Starts with an L. We got one guess. Anyone else? So Melissa does have it. It is a lateen sail. It was a lateen sail, which were very commonly used in the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. But why lateen sails are really helpful is they make it very easy to steer, ships in whatever direction you want them to go. And so this ship uses square sails, which were used for a very long time in the Mediterranean Sea, in the North Atlantic, where like England and France are. But the addition of this lateen sail makes it very easy to steer the ship. And so this is a big deal. This is the reason I've shown you this, is because this ship, the carrack type ship, is a combination, is one example of a combination of kind of native European innovations in ship sailing and shipbuilding, and a combination of outside influence, outside knowledge. And these two things together form some of the basic contextual factors of the Age of Exploration. And we're going to delve into this over the course of the slides, but I just want to give us something to kind of start off with. So really quick, what I mean by Carvel built is this is one of the big changes in European shipbuilding, is that pre sort of Age of Exploration, pre-1400s, most ships were built like, as you see on the left. They call this a clinker build. And this is where the planks of the ship overlap on one another in order to keep water out. And while that is effective, it requires a lot of additional work in the form of nails and tar for the overlap. And it doesn't quite leave as much cargo space. Whereas the Carvel build It does use a little bit more tar, but it creates more cargo space in a ship and allows ships to go deeper. And so this is one of the big innovations that comes around in Europe during this time. It's what we call the Caravelle-built ship. Not to be confused with the Caravelle type ship, which we will talk about. But this is an example of some of the important technological developments that make the age of exploration possible, and to a certain extent cause it as well as make it possible. So I just want to kind of start us off with this. Now, real quick, what's contextualization? So again, if you saw the master Let's see. Whoop. Okay, I think we're back. All right. Oh boy. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Let's see. All right. Can everyone hear me? I think we're back. Just want to make sure. Okay. Beautiful. All right. Yeah. New place, new Wi-Fi. It's always a fun thing to do. Okay. Sorry. I have so sorry about that small interruption. Let's head on back to where we were. Sorry. I see that it sounds like from what Melissa was kind of doing a little knowledge check there, some people have talked a little bit about junk ships and DAOs, and I'm actually glad she brought that up because we're going to, I would hold that DAO for just a second because that's going to come back. But real quick, just contextualization, what it looks like, the kind of thing that you might be expected to do if, say, you received a contextualization question on an SAQ, or the kind of question you might see on an MCQ, which we'll practice a little bit later. So I want to give you this example of something that hopefully everybody's pretty familiar with, which has to do with the Mongols. So let's say you were being asked to contextualize the Silk between, say, 1000 and 1450. Let's say that was what you were being asked to contextualize. Write an answer that analyzes the development of the increase in trade along the Silk Road between 1000 and 1450. Okay, so the Silk Road between 1000 and 1450 and your development. This is what you're being asked to contextualize. So perhaps two possible causes, events happening in context of this, might be the Mongol conquests or increased technological diffusion, such as caravanserais, camel saddles, horse saddles. These could be things that could be a contextualizing cause of this increase in trade. And so you could make the case that the increasing trade along the Silk Road is in part under the context of a Mongol conquest or could be in the context of new trade. That is not necessarily to say that new trade and the Mongol conquest was the cause of these things. There can be many causes of something, but the context of these things and maybe how that context might play a little bit into the cause. So, for example, here are just some arrows clarifying kind of what we're looking at. So let me give you using specific examples kind of show what I'm talking about. So, for example, explain the cause of the increase in trade along the Silk Road between 1000 and 1450. I should have used the word context. I should have used the word cause there. I think it's a little misleading. So, for example, here we can answer the contextualization. So, the conquest of Genghis Khan and his successors after 1300 created a large Mongol empire covering most of the Silk Road. So that's kind of a historical context for this specific context. So, for example, Genghis Khan, his successors create this empire during the time period in which we're talking about. And then the Mongol state, taxed trade, which is something we know they did in general. But we're not necessarily talking about the Silk Road specifically, right? But their policy, their general policies that applied pretty much no matter where they were, whether they were ruling in Iran or ruling in China or ruling in Russia, was that they did encourage trade. Silk Road, the context of Mongol pro-trade taxation led to the increasing exchange of things such as porcelain or precious stones, which were two very commonly traded on the Silk. So again, Mr. Liddle, doesn't this sound a lot like causation, right? You even confused yourself by putting the word cause in there. And the answer is, yeah, it's a little bit of causation, but it's more about what was going on around that time. So on the Silk Road, an event happening kind of around it was the fact that there were these Mongols running around, conquering states and creating world empires. So that's a possible way to contextualize a particular event. And we'll have another example a little bit later on. Before we get going into the super detail we're going to talk about, Any questions from anyone for any reason on any cause? And Mr. Davenport has joined. Well, welcome, Mr. Davenport. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, we'll go ahead and just get into like the meat sort of what we're going to talk about today. So topic 4.1 is the most of what we're going to be talking about. And here it is in summary. The theme for topic 4.1 that the College Board wants you to be familiar with is technology and innovation. And they have two sort of points they want you to know. The first thing they want you to know is that knowledge and scientific learning from the class, aka ancient Greek, ancient Romans, ancient Indians, ancient China, Islamic and Asian worlds spread. And also that developments included the production of innovations in ship design, which I touched on a little bit, improved understanding of winds and currents, all of which made transoceanic travel and trade possible. So what College Board is really emphasizing is that you need to be familiar with the causes of transoceanic trade, the scientific and technological of transoceanic trade. And so we're gonna delve right into that. Again, as if you watched my increasing productivity video about a month ago, I referenced the old AP World key concepts. They were more succinct. And so this is actually one of the old key concept 4.1, which basically kind of sums it up really nicely, which is that European technological developments in cartography and navigation built on previous knowledge developed in the classical. So, it's a two-pillared context. It's regular, it's European innovations, but it's also building on previously existing innovations. So it's kind of a two-pillared system. So here's some vocabulary, some things I'm going to talk about a little bit later on that you may want to take a note of. The first three have to do with technology, innovations, and knowledge. The last one has to do with sort of an additional contextualizing point that I'm going to bring up a little bit later. Is Caravel, which is a Portuguese ship. The second one is something called the translation movement that I'm going to get into a little bit, which is how some of this knowledge was diffused. The Volta do Mar is a series of winds that blow off the coast of West Africa. And again, when we talk about knowledge and information, knowledge of physical events and physical occurrences counts. And so knowledge of these winds is going to be, that knowledge is going to be very important later on to the Europeans. And as well, we're going to talk about a guy named Prester John. That's going to come a little bit later. So wouldn't worry. I mean, go ahead and take note of it now, but we're going to get into that in more detail a little bit later. As I mentioned last time, and as a lot of us streamers are mentioning, these vocabulary are something you can consider using maybe during an essay. They might count as evidence on an SAQ, things that might help strengthen your argument. And so we bring them here just so that you have a little bit of something to work with. You know, sometimes we might go off on a tangent. We might ramble a little bit. We try not to, but, you know, it happens. And so we sometimes want to make sure you get something out of it, so we include a little vocabulary. I have a guest from Nigeria. Well, welcome. Must be early or late over there. So let's go ahead and talk first a little bit about Asian technology in Europe. So again, the two pillars that we're discussing today: technology from outside of Europe that has been utilized by Europeans, and then indigenous European technological innovations. So let's first quick talk about some Asian technology. So two really big technological developments that come from Asia that are really big in Europe and help make the age of exploration possible include gunpowder and the magnetic compass. Now, I've included a picture here, which is the earliest known depiction of any sort of weapon that might be used with gunpowder. This is actually from the Daozu rock carvings, which are found in Western China. And this particular picture dates from 1128, and you can see an individual on the right holding what appears to be a gigantic bag. This is what we would call a hand cannon, and there seems to be an explosion coming out of it. According to the source, there used to be a lot more on the end there, but it's been broken off over the millennia that this thing has been in existence. Gunpowder is really important, and we're going to see why in just a second. The magnetic compass is also really important. Finding your way. You can't sail across the ocean if you don't know where you are. Now, as has been pointed out by some people, Europeans have known about lodestones. Lodestones are not unique to China. Ancient Greeks knew about lodestones. Ancient Indians knew about lodestones. So lodestones, that is a magnetic stone that points north, is not anything new, but the Chinese were the first ones to put it into a compass that points north no matter where you go. And so in this sense, we do tend to attribute a magnetic compass to the Chinese around the year 1000. So these are two technologies from Asia that are going to be really important in Europe during this time, that are going to make the age of exploration possible. Their transfer is going to be a really important part of the European age of exploration. So my question for you is this: where might this technology have come from, right? So where might this Asian technology have found its way into Europe? How does it get there, right? Because we know that gunpowder is going to be important, and we know that a compass is going to be important. Christopher Columbus had a compass while he was sailing, but how does it get to Europe? It doesn't just magically get up, walk there. How does it get there? So we got one guess. We have one I shouldn't say guess. We have one educated deduction. Guess has such a negative connotation. We have an educated deduction. Kevin said the Silk Road. Melissa pointed out encounters with Islamic civilizations. Okay. Any other educated deductions? Well, those are both really good. In a sense, they're both correct. I actually have a separate slide for encounters with Islamic civilizations. But when it comes to the Silk Road, yes, that is a big one. If we recall, there is an event that begins to take place in the 1300s that really permanently links Europe with Asia in a way that it had not previously. That event is the Mongol conquests. So the Silk Road is important, but what's important to understand is that during this time, there was a particular event, which were the Mongol conquests going on across Europe. And I bring your attention to a particular battle that happened in 1241 between the Mongols, who were running through the Balkans, or sort of southeastern Europe, chasing some renegade Mongols, actually, who were running away. And they were given sort of refuge by the king of Hungary. And then Genghis Khan said, I want my renegades back. Or not Genghis Khan at that time, but some other Mongols said, we want these renegades back. And the king of Hungary said, you can't have them. We're going to keep them. And so then the Mongols went on a tear, just kind of running through the Hungarian kingdom and wrecking everything. And in one particular battle, the Battle of Mohi, we know that the Mongols brought gunpowder weapons to bear against the Hungarians, and to devastating effect. But most scholars believe it was at this moment that gunpowder weapons were transferred to Europe. It's after this battle that we begin to see some Eastern armies, and by Eastern I mean Eastern European armies, equipped with guns. And then guns gradually become more and more widespread throughout Europe. So it is important that the Silk Road is also a big thing, but that the conquest of the Mongols is a particularly contextualizing event that makes gunpowder possible. The compass also probably, although there is some debate as to how exactly the compass came to Europe, more so than there is the gunpowder. And so I want to talk a little bit about Islamic knowledge, as Melissa said earlier. That's another really important avenue, if you will, of transfer. And so two things from the Islamic world that become really important for a continent that's about to set out on a gigantic series of explorations would be astronomical charts, because in the pre-GPS days, it was really important to know where you were using the stars. You can find the stars. You can measure your angle relative to the stars, and you can determine where on the map you might be. Astrolabes are really good for this. But one of the great things that the Iberians, aka the Portuguese and the Spanish, got from the Islamic world are these really accurate astronomical charts. And so I've included a picture here of a formation called the Great Bear, Ursa Majora, which actually includes the Big Dipper. So the tail and the back end of the bear is actually the Big Dipper, and then these additional stars complete the constellation. And the other big important object that came through in contact with Islamic civilizations was the lateen sail. And so earlier, I'm not sure who said it. I think it might have been Kevin, I believe, said it earlier. Talked about dhows as being a sailing technology that you reviewed in class. Dhows used lateen sails, and lateen sails make your ship easy to steer. And while lateen sails had been used in a little bit of the Eastern Mediterranean, they'd never really made it over to the Western Mediterranean or the North Atlantic. That's France and England, until the Europeans had closer contact with the Islamic civilization, specifically in Spain. And so one other thing I want to really make clear is that this Islamic knowledge is a good deal of original research by Muslim scholars, and I've put a link in the resources to a video where they'll talk all about Islamic scholars in like Unit 1, Unit 2. But it's also it builds on ancient Greek knowledge. Important to note, it builds on ancient Greek knowledge. And so my following question for you now is the same one I asked earlier, which is, where would Europeans have encountered this Islamic knowledge, and where might they have picked it up? So what series of events perhaps might have resulted in a lasting close contact encounter between European civilizations and Islamic civilizations? And actually, there's one that I mentioned in here that's no longer actually in the course, but it is nonetheless really important. It's not in the course anymore, but it is important. Hector, Mr. Davenport said the Crusades. Yeah, that's one of them. Definitely. A couple hundred years, the establishment of independent Crusader kingdoms in Jerusalem, Acre, and parts of what's now Turkey. That definitely is lasting close contact between the Islamic world. That's where chess actually was diffused. If you ever wonder where chess comes from, it actually was diffused to Europe during the Crusades from the Islamic world. That's where we get chess from. The Crusades are the big one. But there is one other one. There's another really big one that's sort of important. I might have hinted at a little bit earlier. Kevin says the Ottoman conquests in Europe. Well, actually, there's something to that. Although it's not quite the way I think you might be thinking of. There is some evidence that during the Ottoman conquest of the Byzantine Empire, the fear of being conquered led some Byzantine scholars to flee west and take their knowledge with them. And so some of the ancient Greek knowledge that people in Europe would get from the Islamic world also came in the form of fleeing Byzantine scholars and their works. So there's actually some truth to that, even though it's perhaps not quite what you're thinking of. There is some truth to that. So I'm going to go ahead and fill you in. There are actually three really big points of contact. So merchants in the Middle East and the Silk Road, still very important. Never underestimate the importance of merchants. The Crusades are the big one, although not officially in the course anymore, but as a contextualizing piece of information, quite important. There's also something called the Reconquista, which you might think of as sort of the opposite Crusades. It was, although that's not quite an appropriate analogy, but essentially the Reconquista refers to the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, what's now Spain and Portugal, by the Christian kingdoms of the north over the Islamic kingdoms of the south. And it was about a 500-year endeavor. But these things, in part, led to what's called the translation movement. The translation movement is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a big effort to translate things. What things? Well, basically books and technology. So a lot of that Islamic learning, which was based on ancient Greek learning, found its way all over the Islamic world. And so in what's now Spain, specifically in a city called Toledo, there was a gigantic library of books. And when the king of Aragon, Alfonso X, conquered Toledo, he commissioned quite a few people to go in there and translate those books out of Arabic and into Spanish. And earlier, some people, even before the king, had been translating them out of Arabic and into Latin. And this was a really big undertaking. I have a chart. I'll put it up in the resources after this is all done. That kind of chronicles all the books translated out of, not all of them, but many of the large ones. And these are books on mostly scientific endeavors. Although I should note that the very, very first book that Alfonso wanted translated was actually a book of children's fairy tales. That actually isn't Islamic at all. It's Indian. It's called the Panchatara, I believe. It's a classic Indian fairy tale. It's a series of fairy tales from ancient India that use animals as sort of moral allegories. And so this was actually the very first thing translated. But then the rest of them were things like Aristotle's on geography, on optics, Ptolemy's Almagest, which is a book on geography. And so there's this really long list of scientific books that get translated out of Arabic and into Spanish and Latin. And this happens in other places too, such as Sicily and Malta, where you have Christians conquering Muslim kingdoms and sort of absorbing some of the knowledge that had spread there during the age of Islamic expansion that we just talked about. It would have been pre-Unit 1. I have a picture here specifically of something called the Alphonsine Tables, named for King Alfonso. And this is actually a synthesis of a bunch of Islamic texts. But basically what it is it allows you to chart the location of the moon and the sun based on the day and where you might be in the world. And so this is a really good example of Islamic knowledge being used, diffused. So that was a lot to say. Are there any questions before we move on? Then if not, I have a question for you. We're going to do a little quick practice question. So on the AP test, you will see what we call contextualizing questions, right? Multiple choice questions usually come in 3 to 4, or sometimes 5 the most questions per document or map or drawing or poster or whatever they may be. And sometimes you'll encounter what's called a context question. And usually this will be either at the very beginning or sometimes at the very end of those questions. And they may be phrased like this: such and such can be best understood in the context of which of the following. Such and such was most influenced by which of the following. Which of the following factors helps explain such and such and such and such? And these are usually referring to the stimulus, the document, whatever it is yourself. So if you see phrases that look like this, you're probably getting a context question. And they're asking about the background of whatever stimulus you're looking at. So again, what's important to understand about these questions is it doesn't matter necessarily what's in the document, but what you're expected to know is the context around the document. So it's kind of a thing to keep in mind. You want to know what's around it, but you don't necessarily have to know what's in it. Okay, so I have a question for you. Here is a paragraph. And here is some questions. So go ahead and take some. I'm going to put this up. I'll read it, but if you read faster than me, that's okay. So here's a document. And Looks like it's about a gentleman named Gerard of Cremona, a poem about the life of Gerard of Cremona. So it looks like this was written after he died by one of his students. So this guy must have been a teacher. Interesting. So let's see what it has to say. Although he had been educated and arrived at the knowledge of the study of the Latins probably referring here to Europeans, nevertheless, because of his love for the alchemists, oh, that's that ancient Greek text on geography I was talking about, which he did not find at all among the Latins, he made his way to Toledo. Oh, that's that city in Spain. Seeing an abundance of books in Arabic on every subject and pitying the poverty he had experienced among the Latins concerning these subjects, out of his desire to translate, he thoroughly learnt the Arabic language, and in his way, trustworthy in each subject matter and the language, a prudent man read through the writings of the Arabs, from which he did not cease until the end of his life to transmit to Latinity. Oh my, there's some interesting words in there. Oh boy. So maybe let's break this down. Let's break this down a little bit. So I'm going to pull it up over here again. So when I looked at this, in addition to looking at who wrote this, so it's not Gerard himself, it's a student of his. So keeping in mind that, of course, a student, a devoted follower, may not have the most clairvoyant, may not have the most clear-headed opinion of someone who they appreciated and loved. Keeping that in mind, I'm looking to see that, so Gerard was an educated person, probably had some education. Since he could read ancient Greek, he was looking for the alchemist, and he didn't find it in the Latins. Now, the Latins, I think, here is referring to Europe in general, probably. Latin being a language used by the Christian Church at the time. He goes to Toledo, which is in Spain. He sees all these books in Arabic. Okay, so they're definitely not in Latin. So he's probably going to have to translate them. And he translates them. But he had to learn the Arab language, which is interesting. He had to learn Arabic himself to translate it. Now, what's interesting about this is that he learns Arabic, but he only does this to translate, which I find actually quite interesting. He doesn't actually learn it because he wants to learn it. He learns it because he wants to get the knowledge, which is interesting. And he read through the writings of the Arabs, and then he transmitted them to Latinity. So he spends his whole life translating texts. That's interesting. Okay. So, thinking about that, let's see. So, the works of Gerard of Cremona can be best understood in the context of which of the following. So, we know that he's in Spain, and we know that he's a Christian. So, let's see. Do any of these have to do with Europe itself? Since we know Spain is in Europe, what could we eliminate? Well, we know it has to do with Europe, but it doesn't have anything to do with adopting Islam. There's nothing in here. So Gerard of Cremona learns Arabic, but he doesn't adopt Arabic to become a Muslim. There's nothing in here about the Middle East. And I don't really know what the Timurid conquests of Persia would necessarily have to do with that. That's kind of a silly one, a little bit of a throwaway one. You usually have at least one of those in every option. You'll have kind of a silly one that obviously is not the answer. But it looks like some people got it. Some people in the chat got it. The answer is C, because this document is talking about the translation movement. Gerard of Cremona was one of the more famous translators. Fun fact, there are actually two Gerards of Cremona. Historically speaking, historians found out not too long ago there actually were two different Gerards of Cremona. So it's been a fun, the fun things you learn in history. And so yes, the answer is, the answer is C. It's the Reconquista in Spain. That's the context. It's not necessarily the cause. Gerard of Cremona went because he didn't really care about the conquest or the Reconquista. He loved knowledge, so he went. So it's not a cause of why Gerard of Cremona went, but it is a contextualizing event. It's something that was going on at the same time. So, any questions about that before we go ahead and move on? Yeah, it looks like most people got, let's see, all right. Cool. So now I want to talk a little bit, we talked about some external contextualizing knowledge that came to Europe from the outside. But now I want to talk a little bit about things that Europeans themselves either improved on or straight up discovered, if you will. And so what I'm going to talk about is new ship types, caravels, flutes, carracks, and galleons, which we're going to talk about, improved cannons, and we're going to talk about understanding of wind currents, which is one of the things explicitly listed in the CDE. And I actually have here a map that explains how the Volta do Mar works. It's a circular wind pattern off the coast of Africa. And what it does is you can take it and you can follow it all the way down to just before you reach West Africa. It'll blow you down. And then if you sail west out into the ocean, you can catch it and it will blow you back up into Portugal. It kind of works in a circle. So that's the Volta do Mar, just in case you're wondering how that works. This diagram right here will explain. So I want to quick talk about cannons. So out of curiosity, I'm just going to throw this out there. When does military technology tend to get better? I mean, I'm sure some of you out there might be military history buffs. A lot of us who are, historians, really, sometimes we get our start studying like World War II, or we study, the military. I started learning history. My grandfather told me about his service in the Korean War. But when does military technology tend to get better? When do we see advancements in military technology? Kevin says during wars, and Hector says during wars and conflict. Yes. Now, as it turns out, Europe was just chock full of wars and conflicts during the early 1300s. Constant wars and conflicts, specifically the 100 Years' War. And I've got a little photo right here. This is the Siege of Orleans, famously where Joan of Arc led the French to victory, where you can see pretty clearly in the front a gigantic cannon. The English also have hand cannons. You can see them off the walls, this like little stick with a little metal tube at the end. The original cannons that came to Europe actually didn't fire cannonballs. They fired actually arrows. They put an arrow in, lit the back, and then the arrow shot out instead. Over time, they improved the technology and made it possible for cannons to fire out solid balls and larger solid steel balls. Till eventually we get the cannons we think of today. And so these improvements are going to be really important because when you start talking about, say, the Portuguese Estado de India or the voyages of Vasco da Gama and the other Portuguese explorers, a really big part of those voyages involved the use of the cannon to kind of force their way into some parts of India. So that's going to be really important. The other thing I want to talk about is a little bit of that caravel that I was talking about earlier. So notice, here's a model really quick of a caravel. Notice it has the two triangular sails, right? It has the two lateen sails. And so while the caravel and all these other ship types use that carvel, that side-to-side plank I was talking about versus the overlying plank design from earlier, Europeans did add that lateen sail, which made it really important and made their traveling faster and easy. But part of the reason Europeans adopted larger hulls was simply that they were doing more business. The early Portuguese and the Spanish states and merchants were doing more business, and therefore they needed bigger ship types. The Portuguese in particular, being on the very edge of Europe, needed bigger ships. And so the carvel and the carrack were very early Portuguese inventions, but later the galleon would be invented by the Spanish and most famously used to transport silver from South America across the Pacific to China, known as the galleon route. Oops, sorry about that. And the flicht would be, it's a Dutch ship, and its specialty is that it is the same size as, say, a carrack, but it requires a much smaller crew, partially because the Dutch as a country has such a small population. So those ship innovations built on one another. And eventually these would make the age of exploration possible. And of course, the Volta do Mar. Now, what's interesting about the Volta do Mar is that Prince Henry of Portugal, or in Portuguese, Prince Henri, discovered, he did not personally, but people under his command discovered the Volta do Mar winds. They kind of figured out how they worked while they were sailing down the coast of West Africa. Not because they were trying to get to India, but because they were actually looking for well, they were looking for riches, which sometimes included slaves, but also just what they called crusading against the Muslims of North Africa, specifically what we would call Morocco. They were seeking to do battle with the Moroccans on the coast. And so in traveling down the coast, they eventually realized, oh, there's this wind pattern here, and if we sail outward, we can come back up to Portugal. So it wasn't like one day a Portuguese person got up and said, let's go look for a wind pattern on the coast of West Africa, or of North Africa. And there was a purpose behind it. And something I'm going to talk a little bit more about is kind of the crusading spirit, which is how some textbooks refer to it. Prince Henry may be called the Navigator, colloquially known as the Navigator, but he could also be called Prince Henry the Crusader, because that dude was really big on crusading. A lot of the reason he did his navigating was a desire to find riches and a new front to do battle with the Muslims that used to rule Spain and Portugal, and now were sort of confined to the North African coast. And so in addition to those European technological innovations that are going to make possible are happening in the context of an age of exploration, there are a few other forces I want to talk about that are kind of going on in the context of the age of exploration. Again, these are not, so to speak, causes, but these are things that are going on that sometimes do play a role, but are not by themselves causes of the age of exploration. So really quick, I want to talk about something called the crusading spirit. So even though Ferdinand and Isabella had effectively reconquered Spain, or what they considered reconquering Spain from the Muslims by the early 1400s, many nobles and young men in Portugal and Spain really wanted to keep up the good fight, as they saw it. And this is what we call the crusading spirit. They wanted to go do battle with the Muslims somewhere, maybe eventually in the Holy Land, although nobody was actually going to the Holy Land at this time from Spain and Portugal. There was also this idea of a guy named Prester John, and he was a mythical king, and he lived somewhere in East Africa. And supposedly he had a massive army of 1 million men. And if only the Christians could link up with him, because he was also Christian, then they could do a joint attack on the Holy Land, and they could destroy the Muslims forever. And so what's really interesting is that while Prince Henry the Navigator was looking for spices, and he was looking for riches, he was also looking for Prester John. We know this because he said, hey, while you're traveling down the coast of Africa, ask people if they know who Prester John is. And it was a really big point about trying to find this legendary Prester John. Who was this guy? What is interesting, maybe even more so, the very first time I heard about that, I thought, there is a Christian kingdom in East Africa. It's called Ethiopia. And I've later learned that sort of the legend of Prester John came out of European basic understanding that at some point in history there had been a Christian kingdom in East Africa. And then just sort of over time this mutated into the legend of Prester John. So fun fact. There's another thing going on kind of at the same time, right before the voyages of Columbus. And that is that Europeans are sort of getting involved in the sugar trade. So right off the coast of Africa, there's a series of islands. There's a couple island chains. One's collectively known as Madeira. The other is collectively known as the Canary Islands. Now, the thing about these two islands is that they're in a tropical latitude, which means they can grow sugar. Now, sugar can't grow in, say, northern Spain or parts of Portugal, but they can grow on these islands. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish begin to grow sugar and other commercial goods on these islands, which bring them a lot of profit, which in turn makes some of them consider maybe we should go look for more lands where we can go get more of this profit. The other thing about these islands is that they had natives on them. So the Canary Islands, which were conquered by the Spanish, had a group of natives called Guanches. That's what the Spanish called them. We don't know what they called themselves. Or they did have a language, but they didn't have a collective word for all of them. The Spanish called them Guanches. And those were eventually defeated by the Spanish and enslaved, as well as African slaves from the coast, usually Muslim Arabs who were captured during the battles, the Crusading Wars, provided slave labor to grow sugar on these islands. And if that sounds a little familiar, that's because later on, that's the very same model that's going to be used in the Caribbean. And so when talking about why it is that the slave labor model of the Caribbean eventually came to pass, part of that is because that model was already in effect on the Canary Islands, just off the coast of Africa, 70 plus years before Columbus ever even set sail for the New World. And so again, it's not that these plantations, again, they weren't a cause of, it's not you had plantations in Madeira, therefore you're going to have plantations. In fact, the Portuguese never even had plantations in the New World, except in Brazil. They didn't have any island plantations, I should say. But it's not like plantations in Madeira cause plantations in Brazil, but it's an event that's happening that kind of provides a bit of a backdrop, right? There was a plantation model in development, and eventually it kind of makes its way over. So not a direct cause, but sort of a background event, if you will, that's connected to the regular event. I hope it's clear. I know some of this sounds like contextualization. This sounds like causation, but it's actually contextualization, right? We're talking about the background processes, the background events that are in part going to be essential to understanding what's going on. So here's an SAQ. Here's a little practice SAQ. So here's a picture. This is actually a tile. This is actually a tile wall. It's about, I want to say it's about 30 feet tall. I've actually been here. This is a tile depiction of Prince Henry during the Battle of Ceuta in 1415. And Ceuta is a small city in North Africa. And this is in the central train station in the city of Porto in Portugal. And so what I'm asking you to consider is to explain one way this image reflects the historical context of European exploration, of the European age of exploration. Actually, fun fact, we do have somewhere, I don't know where it is right now, but there is a photo of me standing in front of this image, and I'm about up to here, where you can see Prince Henry's leg. So this thing is about 30, 40 feet high. It takes up the entire wall of the main train station. So let's take a look at this image. So I'm looking at this, and some things jump out at me kind of while I'm looking at it. So let's see. Dylan pointed out that the man looks very handsome. Yes, he does. He looks young and dashing, and I think that might not have been an accident. Call me crazy, but I think that might have been on purpose. So I'm looking at this kind of picture, and I'm just looking at some of the details, and I'm thinking that this pretty obviously is a battle. I mean, it says battle in the title, but there's a lot of information. You definitely know this is a battle. There's spears, there's swords, there's what looks like a firearm. There's people in armor. This person looks like Prince Henry, clearly in the center, or probably if it's not Prince Henry, I'd be very surprised. There's dead people around here with armor. So this is very clearly a battle. If there's no doubt in your mind, this is definitely a battle. And I'm noticing here that the Portuguese flag with the standard of Portugal does look like a cross. Somebody pointed that out in the very beginning. They said, this looks like a cross. And you're right, it does look like a cross. That's interesting. And I'm thinking that's interesting because North Africa has been Muslim for a really long time. We remember way back in Unit 1 when we learned about Islam, and we saw the map where it showed the Islamic world. I'm like, yeah, North Africa has been Muslim for a long time, so that's interesting. So the Portuguese, with their cross-like symbol, are attacking North Africa. And I'm noticing the architecture. I'm kind of looking in the background, these kind of white stucco houses. Those do look very Mediterranean, but also somewhat Islamic. And so I'm thinking this Ceuta is probably a Muslim city. I'm thinking, okay. And Ceuta's on the coast, right? It's on the North African coast. And maybe this is actually a trading post. So perhaps there's some sort of economic incentive here for this attack. Interesting. Interesting. Hector has reminded me that rulers do use art to legitimize rule. As I actually also alluded a little bit to that in my last stream about the Islamic empires, the empire empires, but he's right. all rulers do use art to legitimize themselves and make themselves look better. That is true. And again, check out that posture, right? He's standing upright, and this character here, who's very clearly, I think, supposed to look like a Muslim, wearing a turban, long flowing robes. I think this is designed to look like the Portuguese image of a Muslim, perhaps. Looks sort of desperate, like he's holding up his sword, not how a sword is supposed to be used. Maybe that's even a firearm, kind of hard to tell. But it's definitely probably not how you're supposed to use a sword. And he's some fallen comrades around him. So, if I had to look at this and explain how this image may have contributed, may be a contextualizing example of European age of exploration, I might personally say one of two things. I might point out that Ceuta, being a trading post, represents the context of the Portuguese and the Spanish seeking to expand their trade routes during this time. And maybe in this case, they used armed conflict instead of maybe more peaceful trading methods. I might also point out that North Africa, being a Muslim land really close to Portugal itself, might represent a prime target for crusading. And we know that during the Reconquista, the crusading spirit itself was very strong. And so maybe this is just another example of the crusading spirit, which was definitely a sort of a context for the European age of exploration. So I might say one of these two things. I think these are both possible correct answers. All right. We're about out of time here. Are there any questions? Some people probably got to get going. I know it's late out there. Are there any questions about that image, about any of this? Okay. Then if you are still with me, and if you're a teacher, I want to really quick just point out a few ways that you could potentially use this in your classroom. How you can kind of talk about exploration technology in your classroom. One of the very easy things to do is you can put them, there are 6 official College Board technologies and things you have to know. You could simply make a gallery walk, put them up on a poster board, put them around your classroom, have the kids annotate them, talk about them, and then discuss them at the end of class. That's a real easy thing to do. You could talk about how technology is really important today. Talk about the things that make international trade possible. Cargo ships, the internet, modern communications, and then ask them to consider what would have made international trade possible back then. You can kind of draw the connection to today to maybe get kids thinking. You could also potentially do what I call the simulation. This is a little bit trickier, requires a little more time, but essentially presenting students with the difficulties of the age of exploration and asking them to kind of brainstorm their possible solutions. So for example, need to carry more cargo. Well, what could you do? You know, what are your options? Maybe give them an A, B, C, D thing. Just kind of let them come to see the important technological developments on their own. So those are some options for teachers. I'm just going to throw that out there just so if you want to talk about this in your class and you're not sure what to do, here are some ideas. One person is asking, will these slides be available for review? They will be available for review. They're listed in the resources. For this particular stream, so you can go ahead and take a look at them anytime. That said, that's all I've got for you. I want to thank you so much, everybody, for hanging with me, especially during we had a little technological difficulties earlier. So thank you so much for sticking around. I appreciate it. And I hope I'll see all of you Wednesday. Again, just remember, if you want to keep going on mastering the DBQ, you can go ahead and reserve your spot here if you click the call to action button. And just remember to keep thinking Fiveable. We're here to help you. I'm here to help you. So hope we'll see you next time.